Japanese is the 13th most spoken language in the world, with over 130 million speakers. It is a complex and enigmatic language which many attempt to learn but few master. Where did it come from? How has it changed? And what made it how it is today? The origins of Japanese are somewhat unclear. Botanica refers to it as a language isolate, which is a language which has no known ancestors. This early form of Japanese, what linguists call Proto-Japonic, had no writing system until roughly the 4th century. Proto-Japonic has no known records, so we have no clue of what it sounded like definitively. What we know about it comes from reconstructions from Old Japanese and the Ryukyuan languages, a fellow Japonic language family used by the people of the Ryukyu Island archipelago. To explain how Japanese developed as a language, we need to establish a historical basis for what Japan actually is. Japanese history is broken down into periods, the first being the Jomon period, where Neolithic peoples who came over during the Ice Age evolved into the Mesolithic. The Yayoi period preceded the Jomon, and it lasted from 300 BC to 300 AD. The Yayoi were an ethnic group who came to Japan in either 1000 or 3000 BC, depending on who you ask. These people brought agriculture to Japan, in contrast to the archipelago's indigenous population, the Jomon, who were hunter-gatherers. Over the centuries, Yayoi and Jomon culture started to mix together to form a distinct ethnic group, the Yamato ethnic group, which is the ethnic group that we think of today when we refer to the Japanese. During this period, Japan started to grow its first permanent settlements due to the introduction of wet rice farming techniques from the Korean peninsula. Permanent populations led to a solidification of culture and ethnic identity. These permanent populations eventually coalesced into what we would call Japan. Preceding the Yayoi was the Kofun period, the first era of recorded Japanese history, and the Asuka period, characterized by the arrival of Buddhism. This stretch of time from 300 to 710 AD, sometimes collectively referred to as the Yamato period, is when Japan as a cultural complex started to form. The Kofun and Asuka periods were not only critical for the development of the Yamato ethnic group, but also for language. During the Yamato period, Japan started trading with China, and Japanese merchants brought plenty of Chinese ideas back to Japan, including their writing. Since Japanese had no official writing system, during the Yamato period, trade records were recorded in classical Chinese. Chinese writing was exposed to the Japanese far before they started adopting it, with evidence going back to 57 AD when the emperor of the Han dynasty Guangwu visited what Imperial China referred to as Hua. Yamato elites adopted many aspects of Chinese society, including a Tang dynasty-style government based on Confucian values. Trade with China and the introduction of Buddhism made a written writing system a necessity. Contemporary Buddhist texts from China were written in classical Chinese. Thus, scholars had to learn classical Chinese in order to understand them. Asuka period officials eventually decided to start writing down Japanese using Chinese characters. Thus, kanji was born. So here is where things start to get tricky. During the Yamato period, elites like religious officials and academics would write with classical Chinese. Originally, the courts would employ scribes to write for them, but eventually, they moved away from this and started learning how to write for themselves. This, however, proved to be extremely difficult, since this involved transcribing spoken Japanese into written Chinese. If that sounds confusing, that's because it was. Effectively, people would read classical Chinese and they would reorder it into Japanese while they spoke. These texts were often annotated with a system called kanbun, which is where markings would reorder the Chinese sentences so they could be read with Japanese syntax. So text would be written in classical Chinese, but read in Japanese. Coming up on the 8th century, we see the dawn of the Nara period, where Old Japanese started to develop. The Old Japanese era of the language was marked by massive linguistic developments. During this time, many foundational Japanese texts like the Nihon Shoki, the Kojiki, and the Manyoshu were written. These texts, especially the Manyoshu, helped standardize the language. Along with kanbun, Old Japanese was also written phonetically with a style called manyogana. This was a method of writing Japanese using kanji. Each kanji character would be used to represent a mora. Mora are similar to syllables, but they represent units of time taken up by a sound. In Japanese, mora are very important, since one vowel length can vary the meaning of a word. Manyogana was notoriously hard to understand since it had no standardization. Typically, one sound could be represented by many characters, and readers could often not tell what sound a character was trying to represent. People navigated this tricky writing system for hundreds of years up until the Heian period, where writing started to develop different forms. This is the time where we start seeing a distinction between written language and spoken language. At this time, the written version of Japanese, or bungo, would evolve into what we refer to today as Classical Japanese. Classical Japanese, or Kobun, was the standardized written form of Japanese used up until the early Showa period. This standardization of Classical Japanese kept it linguistically consistent over the centuries, as spoken Japanese began to deviate greatly. Classical Japanese also used kyujitai, which are the traditional forms of kanji characters. Take this character meaning body. This is the kyujitai form, and this is the shinjitai, or modern form that we use today. They mean and are read the same, but they look completely different. Lots of traditional Japanese poetry, art, theater, and music is written in Classical Japanese. Waka, haikus, no drama, etc. This period also saw the introduction of kana, a writing system that made it much easier to transcribe spoken Japanese. Cursive forms of Manyogana led to hiragana, which is why today, hiragana is very swoopy and organic looking. Hiragana was developed mostly by Heian women for unofficial writing, as a more rounded and delicate stroke style was perceived as feminine and womanly. Katakana also appeared around this time too. Katakana was invented by Japanese Buddhist monks, and they came from pieces of kanji, which is why they are more angular and rigid. Originally, katakana was used for Sanskrit words, but it eventually would start to be used for other loan words and things like automatopoeia. During the beginning of the Kamakura period, Japan transferred into a shogunate society, which was essentially a hereditary military dictatorship. This shogunate emerged out of centuries of conflict and wars. Contemporary Buddhist scholars believe that this conflict was caused by an age of dharmic decline. In traditional Mahayana Buddhist thought, Buddhism will decline throughout history, as predicted in the Lotus Sutra. From this concern came a collection of new Buddhist schools and institutions meant to appeal to the common people. With the implementation of the shogunate, power within Japanese society switched from a more centralized aristocracy to a more localized system. Buddhism then became the religion of all classes of society. Thus, the ability to read and write became necessary to understand Buddhist texts. As Buddhism became adopted by local societies, Buddhist and Shinto customs started to merge. This movement, known as New Buddhism or Shinbukyo, led to schools like the Nichiren, which focused less on elite formalities and more on Buddhist beliefs and practices for the people. The beginning of the Kamakura period marked a linguistic shift in Japan. During this time, some of the first non-Chinese loanwords were added to Japanese, typically from Portuguese. Portuguese Christian missionaries brought over many foreign products to Japan, and words like tabaco and pan, meaning tobacco, and bread, come from Portuguese words. Tempura, one of the most famous Japanese foods, also comes from Portuguese. The word tempero means seasoning. The beginning of the Edo period led to a consolidation of power among the Kanto region, more specifically in the city of Edo, modern-day Tokyo. This led the Edo dialect of Japanese to become more widespread than the previous Kyoto dialect. The Edo dialect would later turn into the Tokyo dialect. At this time, very few elites still wrote completely in classical Chinese, preferring to use a system called Wakan Kon Kobun. In this system, kanji were used for nouns and verbs, and kana for verb endings and other grammatical elements, very similar to modern-day Japanese. The Edo period saw the rise of sakoku, isolationist practices that cut off all foreign influence over Japan, except from trade from the Dutch and the Chinese. The only non-Chinese loanwords that were adopted into Japanese during the Edo period were from Dutch. The Dutch resided and trained in the port city of Nagasaki, which was Japan's only connection to the outside world. Some common Dutch loanwords include gurasu, alcohol, and koolhi, from the Dutch words glas, alcohol, and coffee. These were all foreign products that were introduced to Japan by the West. Sakoku ended in 1853, and from that came additions of European loanwords, primarily from English. After the Meiji Restoration, there was much talk about script reform for Japanese. The Meiji-era government found that linguistic reform was crucial to uniting Japan as a nation. Since the 1800s, Japan was linguistically incongruent. People were typically literate in their own local dialects, but only a small fraction could communicate with others in different regions through writing. Arabic numerals were added in 1872 when the Meiji government implemented a Western-style mathematics in school systems. Prior to that, they used the Chinese system of counting. In the 1890s, the First Sino-Japanese War proved seminal to the consolidation of a national language. Though Japan won the war, they sometimes had difficulty communicating effectively due to linguistic differences throughout the nation. Many writers around this time became fatigued with the old archaic Kanbun and Manyogana systems, since they were not representative of spoken Japanese. Kanbun started to fall out of style since it was archaic and relatively disconnected from spoken Japanese. The 20th century saw many writing reforms, including the standardization of kana and kanji. This made Japanese easier to read since it effectively got rid of hentaigana or kana variant characters. Following World War II, even more language reforms occurred, specifically with kanji. Kanji became standardized in the 1940s with a system called shinjitai, literally new character form. This was a simplification of the characters. Though mostly obsolete, kyujitai are still in use in some contexts, mostly for stylistic effect or on old signs predating World War II. More kanji simplifications have come out within the past 100 years than just these though. The Japanese Ministry of Education issued a list of general use or toyo kanji in 1946. This standardized 1,850 kanji for everyday use. This list was replaced with the joyo kanji in 1981, which added 95 more characters, and was most recently expanded on in 2010 to a total of 2,136 characters. Someone fluent in Japanese will know the joyo kanji, plus a handful of kyujitai characters as well. Today, approximately 10% of Japanese loanwords are gairaigo or non-Chinese loanwords. Most of these are English. The influence of English on Japanese is far more prevalent than a lot of people realize. Younger generations of Japanese people are increasingly using more and more English loanwords, and this number could increase in the future. Kanji is becoming less common amongst casual handwritten Japanese, since most writing today is done digitally with computers that autocomplete kanji. As the population of Japan declines, so does the amount of Japanese speakers. The future of Japanese and the future of Japan is looking uncertain and possibly grim. If it's not remedied, Japan could slowly die out over the next century. However, if Japan's population starts to increase again, we could see a strong and sustainable Japan with a bright future, and hopefully many centuries more of linguistic development for Japanese. Thank you all for watching.